Darren Watkins Jr., also known as IShowSpeed, is a Black American from one of the most violent areas in America. And I'm not talking about his hometown, Detroit. I'm talking about the state of Georgia. Darren Watkins Jr. was born to Darren Watkins Sr. and Tiffany Graves. Focusing on the Watkins line, Darren comes from a long line of present Black fathers. Darren Watkins Sr. was born to Larry and Elizabeth Watkins, and Larry was born to Harold. Harold Watkins was the first Black American fire chief in the city of Detroit. He was made fire chief in 1988. The first Black member of the fire department, Alfred Brown, was hired in 1894. But it wasn't until 1938 that two more Black Americans were hired, Marcina Taylor and Marvin White. And you know the white community was not happy about their hiring. A mob of about 200 people blocked the streets when Mr. Taylor and Mr. White showed up on their first day. According to sources, it was a July day in 1938, a morning for slow-moving ceiling fans and icy soft drinks, not flushed faces and yells of rage. After members of the firefighters union spread word through the neighborhood that Black firemen were coming, an angry white crowd quickly formed. The crowd swelled and swelled until Mayor Richard Reading finally sent top officials to the scene. But their ordeal was just beginning. It had been challenging enough getting hired by a fire department that refused until 1935 to give Blacks job applications. A U.S. Postal Service employee, Snow Grigsby, had founded the Civil Rights Committee in 1933 to battle discrimination in the Black hiring. Using his research to document institutional racism, Grigsby spurred changes in Black hiring at the Detroit Board of Education, Detroit Edison, Detroit Receiving Hospital, and the U.S. Postal Service, and the Detroit Fire Department. Of the Black men who passed the firefighter's exam in 1935, Marcina Taylor wound up number 1 on the job eligibility list, and Marvin White was number 2. After becoming firemen in 1938, the two men faced a tougher test. Without flinching or blinking, they had to look raw racism in the eye. For 6 weeks after their first turbulent day at work, the men received police protection against residents in the surrounding area who rolled around shouting racial epithets. The two men's presence also stirred up alarm in their fire station's house. Co-workers refused to eat or sleep in the same room with them. Taylor and White had to bring their own dishes, pots and pans to work and cook for themselves after the others were done. By 1980, Detroit continued to hire Black firefighters in low numbers. According to department figures, 21.4% of the members of the firefighting division are Black. Only 5 of the 390 top-ranking jobs are held by Blacks. The city's population was roughly 60% Black during this time, so the Black representation in the fire department was not reflective of the general population. So Harold Watkins, Speed's great-grandfather, becoming fire chief in 1988 was long overdue. Harold's father, Jesse Watkins, also had an impressive career. He worked for the Ford Motor Company as a grinder. Working at Ford presented Black Americans with a steady income. By 1940, Ford employed roughly half of Detroit's Black American male population. With his income, Jesse was able to purchase a home and support his 9 children. Jesse Watkins and his wife Clara McClintock were both born in West Georgia. Jesse was born to Handy Watkins and Susan Chapman, while Clara's parents were John McClintock or McClintock and Mariah Hammonds. Now, this is when Speed's tree takes an unexpected turn. Looking at the White Watkins, Chapman, and McClintock families, we can clearly see that some of the Black Watkinses, Chapmans, and McClintocks traveled along with them as enslaved people. Handy Watkins, Speed's third great-grandfather, was born in Coweta County, Georgia, and passed away in Floyd County, Georgia. The town Noonan in Coweta County, Georgia is the same area where the white Watkins family is from. James Ransom Watkins, born in South Carolina, received land grants after the Indian removal and established himself in this part of Georgia. He enslaved about 15 people by 1860. Then there is Handy's wife, Sarah Chapman. Her grandfather was Jack Chapman. His birthplace is listed as North Carolina. The white Chapmans in the area were from South Carolina. They arrived in this northwest area of Georgia after receiving land in the Cherokee land grants, and they hoped to strike it rich in Georgia's gold rush. Yes, beginning in 1829, Georgia had a gold rush which further disrupted the colonist-American Indian relations. As for Darren's second great-grandmother, Clara McClintock, we can see that her grandmother, Leah, was living near the white McClintocks in Clay County, Alabama. We also see she was born in South Carolina, like the white McClintocks. On the 1860 slave census, William Richard McClintock has an enslaved woman that is likely Leah, as the birthdays are exactly the same. So this is Speed's fourth great-grandmother listed as an enslaved woman in Alabama. Now, if you look at Leah's birthplace, it reads Clay County, Alabama. But Clay County wasn't formed until 1866. Clay County was carved out of Randolph County. Randolph County, Alabama was created in 1832 during the Indian removal. It is likely she was enslaved by the family in South Carolina and brought to Alabama. She moved to Rome, Georgia after emancipation. Some of Speed's ancestors were surely in the area before the whites arrived. You see, the Indian Removal Act paved the way for white settlers to move into the area. They took advantage of the land lotteries and land grants, just like they did in East Georgia following the American Revolution. The white settlers who enslaved Speed's ancestors were terrified that the Indian tribes would attack them. These American Indian tribes were known for raiding plantations and capturing enslaved people. They would return again and again, depleting the colonists of their workforce and everything they needed to survive. The whites began to associate the American Indians with Negroes because there were so many American Indians who mingled and intermarried with the so-called imported Africans over the years that the colonists could not clearly tell them apart. The white American press referred to the Seminole stronghold in Spanish Florida as the Negro Fort, despite the population being mostly indigenous Seminole American Indians. President Andrew Jackson, at the time he was a general, sent American troops to destroy the fort in 1816 due to the fear that the Seminoles would attack the white settlers. Captain Frederick Marryat also took note of the looming doom of American Indian and Negro unity. He stated the greatest misfortune which could happen to the United States would be the union of the Negroes and the Indian tribes. If this were to take place, the Indian population would rapidly increase instead of falling away as it is now. And as then the Negro population would till the ground sufficiently for the support of themselves and the Indians, leaving bands of Indians along the frontier free to attack white settlement. Yes, the colonists were terrified that the American Indians would unite with the Negroes and end their encroachment. Unfortunately, many people talk about the 5 civilized tribes and how they enslaved many Negroes. Only the mixed-race half-white natives participated in large-scale plantation society. Creek leaders and wealthy mestizos continued to discipline slaves. Their plantations held most of the enslaved Negroes in the region. Big Warrior, for example, the leader of the Creek National Council, reportedly cultivated a fine plantation with 70 or 80 Negroes near the Tuckabatchee. These half-European men signed treaties in favor of their European ancestry and consistently disappointed their kin. William McIntosh, who was half-white, half-Creek, was hated by his Creek cousins. He was trying so hard to assimilate the Creek Nation to the white settler ways. The Creek faction, known as the Red Sticks, murdered him and freed his enslaved people. So it is clear that a small minority of half-white tribal members participated in chattel slavery. Some go as far as to say the 5 civilized tribes were just like the white colonists in their participation of chattel slavery, but clearly this is unequivocally false. The only reason why some tribal members enslaved Negroes was due to the threats they received from the white colonists to assimilate or else. And I quote, "On the surface, it would appear that the history of slavery among the Southern Indians closely resembles the history of slavery among the Southern whites. Yet this comparison is misleading, for the peculiar institution assumed a far different character in the Indian culture than it had in the white culture. Indeed, it is difficult to assert that some of the blacks held by the Indians were actually slaves. Among the Seminoles, for example, the slaves, in quotes, were only required to pay a small tribute to their master, say 2 or 3 bushel of corn, or when they raised stock, a beef or 2. This tribute was due annually, and the slaves remained otherwise completely independent. How is that slavery? That sounds like taxes to me. Are taxes slavery? Okay, back to it. The Seminoles were probably the most liberal of the 5 civilized tribes in their treatment of slaves. These Indians held their Negroes in a sort of benevolent bondage, and except for their annual tribute of grain or livestock, they were practically members of the tribe. In early 1835, the Seminole agent Wiley said, "The Negroes in the nation have always had a great influence over the Indians. They live in villages separate and in most cases remote from their owners and enjoy equal liberty with their owners. Many of the slaves have stocks of horses and hogs with which the Indian owner never assumes the right to intermeddle. In addition, many fugitive slaves made their way to the Seminole Nation where they lived in total freedom and were protected by the Indians." That sounds nothing like chattel slavery that the Europeans practiced, if it was slavery at all. The relationship between the Indian and the black races was often quite close. The Indians often interacted socially with their bondsmen, and blacks often helped instruct the Indians in matters relating to white culture. Literate blacks sometimes taught their Indian masters to read, introduced them to Christianity, and served as important communication bridges within the white society. Intermarriage was common, and the black partners in such marriages was sometimes admitted full membership in the tribe. The relationship between Indians and blacks become clearer when the position of free blacks in Indian society is examined. Free blacks resided in each of the 5 civilized tribes. In 1832, B.S. Parsons, a government census taker among the Creek Indians, noted, "There is a number of free black families that seem to be in every way identified with these people, and the only difference is the color." These blacks were, in fact, often granted complete citizenship in the Indian nation. This narrative is one that I never seen shared in the media, TV, or even most classrooms. That's a clear alliance between American Indians and Negroes. Now listen to this. The whites had encouraged what they believed to be the Indians' natural aversion to the Negroes, but by the middle of the 1760s, some whites suspected that the antipathy was disappearing. Governor Wright reported that the Earl of Hillsborough, Secretary of State for the colonies, that the Indians not only were harboring fugitives, but also were enticing slaves away from their masters. The former slaves lived in such an idle life in the Indian country that they had an idea of being free. Loss of property and labor was detrimental to any province, but Wright had another fear. If an Indian war occurred, the Indians would arm the former slaves against the colonists and use the blacks to encourage those still in bondage to rise against their masters and join the Indians in order to obtain their freedom. Again, this is a unified front. Accounts of mixed African and American Indians listed by name. This is how Speed's family came to be. IShowSpeed's deep connection to this region of Georgia shows his family's tenacity and their will to keep fighting, even in bondage. If Speed was to take a DNA test, the autosomal ancestral breakdown likely would not show his American Indian heritage. These tribes were displaced and intermingled with many other nations, including foreigners. Commercial DNA tests do not have these tribes represented in their databases. For Speed to have ancestors that have deep roots in this area, some of its ancestors being born in this western portion of Georgia prior to the Indian removal, to see them listed as mulatto. These are all clear indications of American Indian heritage, which I plan to explore deeper. IShowSpeed comes from people who always put their best foot forward no matter what, and I can see that in him. Thank you for watching American Hidden History, and stay tuned for more.